Hello everyone, it's been a while. So recently, every time I post a new video, there's always someone in the comments who says, "Hey, are you going to post a video about Reflux in Tier 4?" So I finally got some time to actually, do some research, do some testing, and so I think I have enough to make a video on the build that I will likely be running when we unlock the full art passive. So let's get into it. The first thing that we can talk about are the skill builds. As of right now, it looks like there are two major builds that you can run. The first one being the stock standard build that you know, the so-called 7 damage skill build. This is the one that we are pretty much using in Tier 3. So you'll notice here that all the skills are maxed out except for Squall, which is your counter, and Blaze, which is your synergy skill. The tripods are pretty self-explanatory. The only thing that has like majorly changed is that Reflux in Tier 4 does have a good amount of mana problems, and so because of that, I am actually currently taking the MP tripod on Punishing Strike to help out with that. For the runes, again, I've always kind of said that runes are personal preference on Reflux, but with Tier 4, we have the addition of a new Poison rune, which is very similar to the Bleed rune. And Reflux is one of those classes that can actually afford a double, damage over time rune, so you can see that I have it slotted here on Blaze and Seraphic Hail. Galewind on the animation slow skills, reverse gravity, esoteric reaction, punishing strike. And then the rest is kind of just a mixture of rage and quick recharge. So again, a placement of these is really personal preference, but I have found this is what works best for me. Now, with the kind of addition of Tier 4 and the removal of Boundless MP, the old 6M Elegian's Touch, the Mana Shield build, has kind of disappeared, but in its place, a new build has kind of popped up. So, this is the new 6 damage skill build. So the idea behind this build is that if you lean more heavily into swiftness in the arc passive, with 7M, right, the other build I was showing you, you tend to run into mana problems and you leave a lot of cooldowns hanging. And so because of that, this build basically just removes a damage skill, typically Inferno because it's the slowest to cast. It takes Squall up to 10 because when Squall is at 10, you get access to the third row of tripods, which gives you basically, I think it's like 10% of your mana back on each cast, which helps alleviate those mana issues. And because you only have 6 skills, 6 damaging skills, you don't leave cooldowns hanging as much. This also allows you to take double counter as well too, so in the event where you want to have kind of hold your counter, you really can with this build. With the other build, you're kind of just throwing it in your rotation to proc some kind of a rune. So here you can see that we take both Ice Shower and Squall. And so again, the runes are kind of personal preference, but typically you'll see this build being used when you are more heavy on Swift rather than crits. And so we'll talk about those breakdowns as we get through this video. Alright, the next thing I want to talk about is general skill damage distribution. With the introduction of Tier 4, you have, things that increase your mana-based damage skills. You have evolution damage, and you have hitmaster damage, so it can kind of be confusing to understand what is better than the other. So this data was taken over 2 runs of Hard Aegir Gates 2, so from my runs here. So by no means is this data like super accurate or anything like that, but it kind of gives us some ballpark figures here. So you'll see the skill and distribution and averages kind of on the left here. And the important thing you'll notice here is that I've characterized the actual type of damage, whether it's mana, meaning that you spend mana and it does damage. You have none, which means that it's kind of outside the realms of influenced by damage, and then other, which, things like Curse Stall and Limit Break will affect. So that's kind of the breakdown there. As expected, most of our damage is still going to come from mana, but with the introduction of the Hyper Awakening skill and the new Bleed rune and things like that and Transcendence, you can see that, roughly like 13 to 15% of your damage is going to be composed of non-mana damage. And so when it kind of comes down to the breakdown in terms of engravings, Hitmaster, MP efficiency increase, and the illicit spell node in the arc passive, these all affect mana damage, whereas Curse Doll and Limit Break, the node from the arc passive, will affect mana in addition to the other damage here. So I've done some kind of napkin math here to kind of calculate a relative efficiency of these engravings and nodes. And so the general rule is that Curse Doll has a drawback but gives you the most amount of damage. Hitmaster is neutral and gives you the middle amount of damage, whereas MP actually gives you a benefit, the mana regen, but gives you the lowest amount of damage. And you can see a little little footnote here about Squall, but honestly it's 0.5% of your damage. Kind of negligible, so I didn't bother trying to do that extra calculation. Now, in the arc passive, your evolution section, you have a choice between illicit spell versus limit break. One increases partially damage of mana skills, whereas one is just flat evolution damage. And you can see kind of the difference here. Overall, everything is pretty marginally within each other, and a lot of this stuff is going to come down to personal preference. But I thought I'd kind of mention it because I'm sure some of you were curious. Okay, let's talk engravings. So, I think the core engraving that Reflux pretty much needs no matter what build or what spread you go is MP efficiency increase. Reflux has some serious mana problems in Tier 4, and if you've kind of made that transition already, you probably know what I'm talking about. It's bad even with mana food. So, MP efficiency increase is a great node that's, not as optimal on the damage, but gives you a lot of quality of life, gives you that mana to keep pumping out spells. As a little side note, the relic books for MP efficiency increase are a lot cheaper than all of your other engravings. So I play on NA West, and they were about like 20k when I first saw them. So I actually bought a full set because I thought it would just be worth it in the long run. So that's why I have it here. Your other kind of mainstay is going to be Grudge, self-explanatory. Keen Blunt Weapon is a really great engraving all the way up to like 75% crit, so it's a pretty solid engraving. Adrenaline pairs nicely with Keen Blunt Weapon, gives you that crit. And then Curse Doll, remember the aforementioned kind of tiers is kind of the most damage efficient. So the swaps you can kind of make is that if you really don't like Curse Doll, you're not a fan of the healing reduction, and you're okay with taking a slight hidden damage, take Hitmaster, right? And then when you start to shift more over into the swiftness area, you can actually replace Keen Blunt Weapon with Raid Captain, because eventually your move speed gets to a point where Raid Captain is more efficient than Keen Blunt. So yeah, those are the engravings. As for gems, again, difference between 7M and 6M. For 7M, you want a damage gem on all of your skills except Squall, so 7 damage gems, and then your 4 damage or cooldown gems on your 4 most impactful skills. You do have a little bit of flexibility here if you want to move around that Infernal cooldown gem. Maybe you prefer it on Punishing Strike or Blaze or Seraphic Hail. Honestly, it's kind of negligible. You can also choose to remove the damage gem off Blaze and add another cooldown gem if you really want to, but in practice it doesn't matter. For 6M, you want a damage gem on all of your skills because you only have 6 of them, excluding your counters. And then for your cooldown, it's a little bit flexible, but generally speaking, this is what I would recommend. Again, you can move it around to Blaze if you'd like and kind of play with it from there. Okay, now let's talk about the Arc Passive. So the first tab in your Arc Passive is going to be the Evolution tab. This is what replaces your stats, your combat stats, and your relic set effects, like Nightmare and things. things like that. So in the first row, you get to choose your combat stat breakdown. Now, unlike Tier 3, where you were kind of encouraged to go full crit because of the, pet multiplier, now that the pet is a flat 160 bonus, there's a lot more variety and diversity when it comes to kind of picking your stats. So, I have a little breakdown. I kind of wanted to see what people were doing in Korea. So this is just a sampling from like the top 20 Reflux players in Korea. Their overall allocation to crit, so you can have at max 30 points. The rest, of course, goes into swiftness. And then the build that they were generally running, the 7 max versus the 6 max. And you can see that it's quite the spread, right? So you have everything from full crit all the way down to like 18 or 16 crit, and then there's kind of a mixture of 6M and 7M. And so I did some testing myself, of course. So I basically took a bunch of different spreads and a bunch of different builds, and I computed their DPS using my character. So the chart you see here is the average of 3 5-minute parses. I casted Awakening once in the beginning, and then I also simulated a 10% crit synergy because I think a lot of these more swift-heavy builds do benefit from having that crit synergy. And in addition to that, in my static, I actually play with the crit synergy, so it was kind of a more selfish thing where I wanted to see what was best for me. And so this is kind of the results that I got here. So you have the spread on the left here, you have the build. You'll notice that the 6M build really only comes into play when you start, leaning more towards that swiftness, right? The relative DPS, again, the average of 3 5-minute parses, and then the percentage gain compared to the weakest build, which in this case was 22 crit, 18 swift, 6M, right? So that's kind of the idea. Overall, honestly, these builds are all within striking distance of one another, right? It's like 3%, 4%. So depending on how much you value that kind of damage, I would recommend choosing the spread that feels best to you, right? I would actually go into Trixion and test them yourself. What you'll typically find is that as you start to trade out crit for swiftness, the feel of the class becomes a little bit better, right? You have more attack speed, more move speed, things tend to flow a lot better, your cooldowns are cycling faster, and your rotation just overall generally feels a lot smoother. However, as kind of the flip side to that, you lose damage per rotation, right? So, if you go through all of your skills once, the biggest damage is going to come from something that is full crit, whereas, if you're more swift, then you're kind of reliant on cycling that rotation multiple times. And as you kind of climb down and introduce more swift, your damage ultimately becomes more reliant on uptime. And so, we've had this discussion before about, crit reflux versus swift reflux. That discussion has come back once again. Honestly, though, again, all these damages are pretty similar, but you gotta remember that this is Trixion, right? So I encourage you to kind of explore what build feels the best to you, and then kind of pick that and then test it out in a real raid. Do analysis and see if it kind of fits the expectations that you want. For me personally, I actually found 26-14 to be a nice spread. That puts you at about 80% crit rates just naturally, which allows you to play with 2 crit synergies, putting you at 100. It's a nice amount of swiftness that you can actually notice, so that your skills actually cast faster. And while it's not as bursty as full crit, I think it's kind of the best compromise, so that's probably what I'll be playing. Alright, in row 2, you kind of have some choices. So on the left, I have nodes that I really don't think you should use. You have Keen Sense, which adds crit rate on top of damage. You might be able to use this if you're like more heavy swift, but honestly, I'd always kind of just prefer the flat damage. There's Optimized Training, which gives you a mixture of cooldown and damage, but the problem is, as mentioned before, Reflux has mana issues, and in all of my testing that I did, any configuration with optimized training at 1 or 2, I generally was running into mana issues, even simulating support buffs and mana food. It was kind of bad. And then Goddess of Blessings, this is Yearning, so please don't take that. So that leaves us with the 2 other nodes, Boundless MP and Illicit Spell. And so you can kind of look at, 3 different configurations of this. So you basically have one that leans towards cooldown and one that leans towards damage, right? So you have the Boundless MP2 versus Illicit Spell 1. You do need Illicit Spell in this case because mana is definitely a problem. This really does simulate what it feels like pre-patch, pre-tier 4, right? Like the old Boundless. You are constantly casting, and if you kind of like that playstyle and you are confident in your uptime, then I would recommend going with that. On the other extreme, you have Illicit Spell 2 plus Limit Break 1. So this is where you're kind of saying, screw the rotation and the cycle, I just want to do as much damage in one rotation as possible. So if you think of a raid that is burst-oriented, this would probably be the best one, right? This will also do the most damage in like an Atrophian window or a support or buff window or things like that. And then you kind of have the middle ground, right? You have Boundless MP1 and Illicit Spell 2, again for mana issues. This is kind of a mixture of good damage during your cycle, but also allowing you to have short enough cooldowns to kind of keep that going, right? It has definitely more downtime than the above option and more uptime than the below option, and I personally think this is a great middle ground for most players. When you look on, Loawa, the Korean website, 99% of people are going to be running Boundless MB1 and Illicit Spell 2, with a small portion running the other builds as well too. So I recommend again to try them out, but for me personally, I'm going to be using that middle one there. Alright, moving on to row 3, this one's pretty clear cut. Unlimited Magic is pretty much the best option. It gives you everything you want: damage, cooldown reduction, and MP cost reduction. It's a win-win-win, right? There's basically no downside to it, right? So quickly going over the other ones, Zealous Smite gives you like 24% crit, which again is just too much crit in most cases. If you do want to lean more Swift, the problem with this is that you don't get the MP cost reduction from Unlimited Magic, and so typically you're screwed. Strike is useless. We're not an entropy class, so it's pretty straightforward. Destruction Charger is just like flat evolution damage, so it's good if you want to really just hit hard in one thing, but Unlimited Magic just gives way too much cooldown reduction, and so I don't think it's worth it. Dominion Timing, if you look at it, is literally just a worse Unlimited Magic. I'm guessing that's more for classes that have skills that aren't MP based. And then Passionate Dance is just, Yearning, so don't take that. And finally, in row 4, again, the most optimal choice here in most cases is going to be MP Furnace. This is the magic addiction replacement, essentially, right? Very efficient. Remember that 88% of our damage comes from mana skills, and if we kind of do the math, the cap is at 24. Damage somewhere estimates around 21 to 22%. It's important to note that if you put, like a focus rune or a mind enhancement tripod on a skill, they don't affect the damage of MP Furnace, which I thought would be true, but it turns out it looks like it's just base damage. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. That's what I saw in my testing, but that's kind of what I saw. So going through some other options, there is like kind of a pseudo Blunt Thorn build. You can try to build around it. I tried playing around with it. You do stupid amounts of damage if you do crit all of your stuff in one, but because of the lack of like cooldown reduction, it really does kind of fall off. And honestly, being capped at 80% just kind of feels bad. I don't know. That's just kind of me. Supersonic Breakthrough, this is the raid captain node, essentially. Honestly, most of the times you're not going to use this, even in a high swiftness build. You usually can't break that cap. Infighting is the least conditional, but only gives about 16 to 17. Standing Striker has like a stack system, and it gives about 19 to 20. Still a bit worse than MP Furnace, and Stable Manager is a support node. So here I would recommend MP Furnace. For Enlightenment, there's not much to say here. You know, this is kind of the optimal setup. You get the most damage per point investment here. And then for your leap, you know, Rushing Glacier, as you saw, is like your second, third highest damage skill. And so you want to prioritize damage and cooldown of that skill as much as possible. Okay, so that's kind of my overview and thoughts about Reflux in Tier 4. So let me go ahead and jump into the game here, and I'll show you the build that I plan on running once we unlock everything. So I'm just going to eat some mana food. I just bought a couple of cheap ones here, and let's go into Trixion. Alright. So this is my stat spread, 16, 16, and 835, right? It's important to note right now that Trixion actually has a bug where it doesn't count your pet buff. So you actually have to subtract 160 from this number. So I'm going to set it to 1456. And you can see that if I do that, my, crit still appears as 1616. So weird bug, whatever, right? Again, this is exactly what I showed you in the PowerPoint. I plan on using 7M because I am going to be leaning crits, gems, exactly as explained. There are my engravings. This simulates yearning. You can earn support buffs. You can add max MP increase and spared absorption and just tick a node here. This simulates the 9% from the new yearning plus a generic 5% from your feast, right? So something like that. And then for the arc passive, again, I'm running 2614. I think this is the blend that feels good for me. I think 1-2 works great here, and then again, these last nodes, you kind of don't have a choice, right? You kind of want to be running these here. For Enlightenment, again, 2 points here and 2 points here. And then, yeah, the leap, right? So I'll go ahead and just do a quick 2-minute parse just to show you kind of what's going on. Nothing too crazy, just so that you can see the rotation in action. So I'll go ahead and mute my mic, and here we go. So yeah, there's the parse. Honestly, this feels good. There's a little bit of downtime so that if during a raid you kind of need to dodge around, it feels good. Generally speaking, you want to be canceling your rhyme arrow with blink. This is just to maintain that magic charge buff. You don't have to do it every time, right? You can always use spacebar too as well. But generally speaking, just so that I don't forget, I like to do that. You can see that because of the blink reduction in arc passive, your blink doesn't cost as much gauge here. You always want to be cycling this on cooldown pretty much no matter what. I try to cast it and then follow it up with a quick recharge to get some cooldown reduction on it, but I think this build flows very nicely, and it's been feeling good in raids, generally speaking. So yeah, that's all I have for you today. I might make an Igniter video later on when I feel kind of motivated to do so. But the last thing I'll kind of end with is some people have asked me whether I am switching between Reflux and Igniter, have I made a decision? And honestly, I still find a lot of fun in playing both of them. It's a little bit masochistic because it does stretch my resources, but I feel the ability to change depending on how I'm feeling is a lot more important than doing slightly more damage on one build versus the other. So for as long as I can, I still plan on playing both builds until Smilegate says, no, you can't do that, pick one. And then at that point, I'll probably choose one. I'm still kind of leaning towards Reflux because I think it's a lot more reliable. It does what I need it to do. And again, I've said this before, but my main goal in this game is to prog and clear the new raids, and Reflux is very good at doing that. Okay, well, that's all I have for you here, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.